17 years. That's how long I've been flushing brake systems, rebuilding calipers, and pulling apart master cylinders that failed before they should have. And the one thing that keeps showing up, the one variable that separates a brake system that lasts 500,000 miles from one that disintegrates at 80,000. Almost nobody in America talks about it. Not your dealership, not the quick lube shop, not the manufacturer's printed maintenance schedule sitting in your glove box right now. Today, I'm going to change that. Stick with me through this entire list because number 7 is going to make you rethink every brake job you've ever paid for. And if you don't want to miss what's coming after this, hit subscribe now. What I'm putting out on brake systems, suspension, and drivetrain preservation is the kind of information I spent 17 years learning the hard way. You don't have to. Let's start with the core problem. Brake fluid is hygroscopic. That means it absorbs water from the air. Every single day your car sits in your driveway, your garage, your parking structure. The fluid inside your brake lines is pulling microscopic amounts of moisture in through rubber seals, through hose walls, through every imperfect junction in the system. This is not a design flaw, it's physics. The question is what you do about it. In America, we do almost nothing. The average American driver never touches their brake fluid unless a mechanic points to it during an unrelated service and says the words, "while we're in here." The average American dealership doesn't have a mileage-based brake fluid interval at all. Some manufacturers print vague recommendations like inspect periodically, which in practice means never. The result, brake fluid in most American vehicles is carrying 3 to 5% water content. Some I've tested were above 7%. The boiling point of fresh DOT3 fluid is 401 degrees Fahrenheit. At 3% moisture contamination, that drops to around 284 degrees. At 7%, you're looking at fluid that can boil under moderate braking loads. When brake fluid boils, it turns to vapor. Vapor doesn't compress like fluid does. Your pedal goes to the floor. That is not a hypothetical. I've seen it happen. In Japan, they don't accept that outcome. The Japanese domestic market maintenance schedule for vehicles like the Toyota Land Cruiser and Lexus LS calls for brake fluid replacement every 2 years regardless of mileage. Not every 45,000 miles. Not when the fluid looks dark. Every 2 years on a calendar like clockwork. The Japanese engineers who designed these braking systems knew exactly what hygroscopic degradation does to braking performance over time. And they built a maintenance interval around what the chemistry actually requires, not around what's convenient for a service model built on deferred maintenance. That gap, not between what the chemistry requires and what the American service model recommends, is what this entire video is about. 12 specific things the Japanese approach gets right that the American approach ignores completely. Some of them cost almost nothing. One of them will genuinely surprise you. Brake fluid replacement interval, the foundational rule. In the US, brake fluid replacement is treated as optional maintenance. And in Japan, it's scheduled maintenance with a hard calendar interval. The correct interval for any hygroscopic brake fluid, DOT3, DOT4, or DOT 5.1, is every 2 years, not every 30,000 miles. Not when it turns brown, every 2 years from the date of the last service. Here's the mechanism. Brake fluid degrades through 2 processes simultaneously: moisture absorption and thermal cycling. Every time you brake, the fluid at the caliper gets hot. Over thousands of heat cycles, the chemical inhibitors that protect the system from corrosion break down. Moisture absorption accelerates that breakdown. What started as high-performance hydraulic fluid becomes a diluted acidic solution that attacks the internal surfaces of your calipers, your master cylinder, and your ABS modulator from the inside out. And I've pulled calipers from Lexus GX46Os with 180,000 miles that were maintained on the Japanese 2-year interval. The internal bores were clean. I've pulled calipers from the same model at 90,000 miles that had never had the fluid changed. Pitting on the bore surface? Seal degradation. Pistons that were frozen or almost frozen. The vehicle with twice the mileage had healthier internals because the fluid was never allowed to corrode them. Fresh brake fluid costs between $10 and $25 per liter. A brake fluid flush at an independent shop costs $60 to $100. A single caliper replacement runs $200 to $400. A master cylinder is $300 to $700 plus labor. A failed ABS modulator is $800 to $1,500. Follow the 2-year rule and you never have that conversation. American dealerships don't recommend the 2-year interval because brake fluid replacement is a low-margin service that prevents the high-margin repairs that follow from neglecting it. The incentive structure is backward for the customer. Moisture content testing. The diagnostic the industry ignores. The Japanese approach doesn't just replace fluid on a schedule. It tests the fluid's moisture content before every replacement to understand how quickly the system is absorbing water. In America, almost no shops own a brake fluid moisture tester. In Japanese dealerships and independent shops, it's a standard tool sitting on the bench next to the scan tool. The instrument is a refractometer or an electronic moisture tester. You draw a small sample from the master cylinder reservoir, test it, and get a percentage reading in under 30 seconds. And fresh fluid should read below 1% moisture. Replace before it hits 3%. If you're seeing high moisture content well before the 2-year interval, it tells you something. Either the reservoir cap seal is compromised, a hose is cracked, or a caliper bleed nipple is leaking past its seal. This matters because the 2-year interval is a population average. Some vehicles in humid climates accumulate moisture faster. Some vehicles with older rubber components absorb it even faster. The only way to know where your specific vehicle sits in that range is to test. A quality electronic brake fluid tester costs $25 to $60. It lasts indefinitely. Buy one. Test your fluid. It takes 3 minutes and removes all the guesswork from the interval question. Yet the failure mode prevented here is not just a degraded boiling point, it's the corrosive damage that contaminated fluid does to every metal surface it touches. Aluminum caliper bores, steel brake lines, iron master cylinder walls. Acidic fluid with high moisture content is not a lubricant. It is a slow-motion corrosive attack on your entire hydraulic system. DOT 5.1 specification. Why Japanese performance vehicles don't run DOT 3 walk into any American auto parts store and ask for brake fluid. The person behind the counter will hand you DOT 3. It's cheap, it's common, and it is technically sufficient for a vehicle with minimal braking demands. Japanese performance vehicles, Lexus LS, Toyota Land Cruiser, GR86, Lexus LC 500, leave the factory with DOT 5.1 specification fluid. Not DOT 3, not DOT 4, DOT 5.1. The difference is not marketing. The dry boiling point of DOT 3 is 401 degrees Fahrenheit. The dry boiling point of DOT 5.1 is 500 degrees Fahrenheit. The wet boiling point, which is what you actually care about once the fluid has absorbed real-world moisture, is 284 degrees for contaminated DOT 3 and 356 degrees for contaminated DOT 5.1. That 72-degree gap at the wet boiling point is the margin between a brake system that handles emergency braking in a loaded vehicle on a downhill grade and one that fades at exactly the moment you need it most. DOT 5.1 is also fully compatible with DOT 3 and DOT 4 systems. It uses the same glycol ether base. You can switch to DOT 5.1 during your next flush with no system modifications. The only thing that changes is the safety margin built into every braking event from that day forward. A liter of quality DOT 5.1 fluid, model RBF 600, ATESL 0.6, Castrol React SRF, costs $15 to $35. Your brake system holds approximately 1 liter of fluid. The cost difference between DOT 3 and DOT 5.1 is $5 to $15 per service. That difference is not worth calculating. Just run 5.1. Caliper piston retraction testing. The check nobody does. Here's a test that's standard practice in Japanese shops, but almost unheard of in American service bays. When your brake pads are replaced, a competent technician is supposed to test whether the caliper piston retracts properly after being pushed back in. Not just physically push it back in. Test whether it retracts on its own when the brake is applied and released. A piston that doesn't retract fully drags the pad against the rotor. A pad that drags generates constant heat. And constant heat degrades your fluid twice as fast. The mechanism: caliper piston seals are designed to retract the piston slightly on release, called the rollback effect. When the seal is worn, hardened, or contaminated by degraded fluid, that rollback diminishes. The piston stays fractionally extended. The pad stays in contact with the rotor. You won't feel it at normal highway speeds. You might notice slightly elevated fuel consumption. You might notice the car pulling slightly to one side, under braking. By the time the pad is worn completely and the caliper is seized, the rotor is damaged, and the fluid running through that corner is significantly more degraded than the rest of the system. I've measured brake fluid temperature at a single dragging caliper versus a freely operating caliper on the same axle. The dragging corner ran 40 to 60 degrees hotter under identical driving conditions. Over 30,000 miles, that temperature differential degraded the fluid in that corner to a moisture content 3 times higher than the opposite side. Test for piston retraction by pressing the brake pedal firmly, releasing it, and checking for a slight inward movement of the piston. If it doesn't retract, that caliper needs a rebuild or replacement before the next pad goes on. Ignoring it turns a $15 seal kit into a $350 caliper replacement and accelerates the destruction of a $200 rotor. Brake hose inspection interval, the part that fails silently Japanese maintenance schedules, include a specific inspection of brake hoses at every fluid service, every 2 years. American maintenance schedules either omit hose inspection entirely or lump it into a vague annual inspection that most drivers skip. This is one of the most overlooked failure points in any brake system. Brake hoses are rubber. Rubber oxidizes, ozone cracking begins at the surface, and eventually the inner liner deteriorates. The inner liner can deteriorate in a specific way that creates a one-way valve, a piece of the degraded inner wall that allows fluid pressure to travel toward the caliper but restricts its return. The caliper applies, the caliper doesn't release. You get a dragging brake that gets progressively worse with heat, and the hose looks completely normal from the outside. I had a customer bring in a Toyota Sequoia at 130,000 miles with a complaint of pulling to the left under braking. Even the left front hose showed no external cracking. The fitting was clean. The hose looked fine. I clamped the hose after releasing the brake pedal and measured the pressure remaining at the caliper. It was still holding 40 pounds per square inch after releasing the pedal on that corner. The hose was acting as a check valve. Replaced the hose for $35. The pull was gone. The alternative, had that hose been ignored, was a seized caliper, a destroyed rotor, and an accelerated fluid degradation that would have propagated through the entire system. Inspect brake hoses every 2 years during your fluid service. Look for outer cracking, especially near the fittings. Flex the hose and look for cracking at the flex points. If there's any exterior deterioration, replace it. The hose costs $20 to $50. The caliper it saves costs $200 to $400. And I bleed sequence. Why the order matters more than the process. Most American mechanics bleed brakes starting from the closest wheel to the master cylinder, which is typically the right front. The correct sequence, the one specified in Japanese OEM service documentation, is from the farthest point first, working toward the master cylinder. Right rear, right front, left front on most vehicles. The logic is straightforward. Air rises and you're pushing fluid through the system from the pump. Starting from the farthest point ensures that old contaminated fluid and any air in the system gets pushed out progressively, rather than being trapped in corners of the hydraulic circuit. Bleeding in the wrong sequence doesn't always produce a spongy pedal. Sometimes it just leaves a pocket of slightly degraded fluid, or a small air bubble in a remote corner of the ABS modulator, or a rear caliper. That pocket doesn't produce a failure under normal driving. Under hard emergency braking, when the ABS system begins cycling and the hydraulic pressure in that corner fluctuates rapidly, the air pocket compresses, The pedal behavior becomes inconsistent, and the system underperforms at exactly the moment full performance is required. The correct sequence is in your OEM service manual, not the aftermarket manual, the factory manual. Download it. It costs $30 for a year's subscription to your manufacturer's service portal, and it is the single most valuable document you own for that vehicle. Reservoir cap seal replacement, the forgotten component. This is the one. And I told you number 7 would make you rethink things. The BrakeMaster cylinder reservoir has a cap. That cap has a rubber diaphragm or seal. That seal is the primary barrier between your brake fluid and atmospheric moisture. When the seal is new and pliable, it flexes as fluid is consumed during braking, expands and contracts with temperature, and prevents humid air from contacting the fluid surface. When the seal is hardened and cracked, which happens with age and heat cycling, it stops sealing. Humid air flows freely in and out of the reservoir with every temperature change. Your fluid absorbs moisture at 2 to 3 times the normal rate. In Japan, the reservoir cap seal is replaced every 4 years as a standard maintenance item. The part costs $3 to $12 depending on the vehicle. It takes 4 minutes to replace. In 17 years of doing this work, I have never seen an American dealership or quick lube shop replace a reservoir cap seal as a scheduled maintenance item. Not once. The cap gets opened to check fluid level or top it off, and then it goes back on. Whether the seal is still functional is never assessed. I started testing reservoir cap seals 3 years ago by visually inspecting the diaphragm and comparing moisture accumulation rates between vehicles with intact seals and vehicles with degraded ones. Vehicles with cracked or hardened diaphragm seals reach the 3% moisture threshold in an average of 14 months. Vehicles with intact seals average 26 months before hitting 3%. Same geography, same climate, same driving patterns. The seal was the only variable. Replace your reservoir cap seal when you flush your fluid. It's a $3 to $12 part that doubles the effective service life of every brake fluid flush you perform. No shop will tell you this because the part is too cheap to be worth mentioning from a profit standpoint. And here's where I'll pause. If you want the complete Japanese brake maintenance schedule organized by mileage and calendar interval, with exact fluid specifications, bleed sequences, and part numbers for the most common Toyota and Lexus models, I've put together a detailed reference document with all of it. It's organized by model and year, covers everything from DOT specification to reservoir seal part numbers, and includes a printable interval checklist you can keep with your service records. The link is in the description. It's the document I wish existed when I started doing this work. Brake line inspection. Steel versus stainless versus coated Japanese OEM brake lines on vehicles exported to humid coastal regions of Japan are coated with a zinc or polymer-based corrosion protection layer. Vehicles sold in dry inland regions sometimes run standard steel lines. The distinction matters because the Japanese engineers understood that the environment a vehicle operates in changes the failure timeline of every component that touches moisture, including the outside of the brake lines. American vehicles destined for northern states, where road salt is applied from November through March, typically have the same steel brake line specification as vehicles destined for Arizona. No regional differentiation. And as a result, brake line corrosion failures are the leading cause of catastrophic brake loss in vehicles over 100,000 miles in high salt regions. The line doesn't fail gradually, it fails suddenly under hard braking when the pressure spike cracks a line that was 80% corroded from the outside. Inspect brake lines every 2 years during your fluid service. Look for surface rust. Surface rust is normal and acceptable. Look for scaling. Raised, flaking rust that indicates the metal below the surface is compromised. Anything that shows scaling or pitting should be replaced. Stainless steel brake line kits for most common vehicles cost $80 to $200 installed. A complete brake line replacement after corrosion-induced failure, which now requires finding the root cause, replacing the line under pressure, and flushing the system that partially depressurized during the failure, costs $400 to $900 and happens on the side of a road. If you live in a salt belt state and your vehicle is over 100,000 miles, have your brake lines inspected at your next service. Don't wait for the 2-year interval if the mileage and geography suggest accelerated risk. ABS modulator bleeding, the step that almost never happens. Modern ABS systems have a hydraulic modulator, a valve body with internal chambers, solenoids, and passages that control individual wheel pressure during ABS activation. This modulator sits between the master cylinder and the calipers. When you flush the brakes using a standard gravity or pressure bleed, you are moving fluid through the primary circuit. You're not necessarily moving fresh fluid through every chamber of the ABS modulator. Contaminated fluid trapped in the modulator continues corroding the internal valve seats and solenoid components even after the rest of the system has been serviced. The Japanese OEM service procedure for brake fluid replacement on ABS-equipped vehicles includes a modulator bleed cycle using the factory scan tool to cycle the ABS solenoids while fluid is being pushed through the system. This ensures that fresh fluid reaches every corner of the hydraulic circuit. Without this step, you're leaving anywhere from 50 to 150 milliliters of old, contaminated fluid in the modulator after every flush. Over 3 or 4 service cycles, that trapped fluid becomes significantly more degraded than the rest of the system. When the ABS activates in an emergency, the exact moment it needs to perform, it's activating with fluid that may be 6 or 7% moisture and has been sitting in a warm metal housing for 4 to 6 years. An ABS modulator on a Toyota or Lexus costs $800 to $1,500. The solenoid valves that fail due to corrosion inside it cost $400 to $800 to diagnose and replace if they're available separately. The scan tool cycle that prevents this costs nothing. If your shop has the software, and any shop doing a proper brake fluid service on a Japanese vehicle should be doing it. Ask your shop whether they perform an ABS modulator bleed cycle with a scan tool. If they don't know what you're talking about, find a different shop for your brake service. Pad compound and fluid compatibility. The pairing most people never consider brake pad compound affects brake fluid degradation rate in a way that almost no one in the American service industry discusses. High metallic and semi-metallic pads transfer significantly more heat into the rotor and caliper than low metallic or ceramic compounds. More heat at the caliper means more thermal stress on the fluid in the caliper and brake hose. More thermal stress accelerates moisture absorption and inhibitor breakdown. If you're running aggressive semi-metallic pads for performance driving or towing, which generates high heat, and you're also running DOT3 fluid on an 18-month service interval, you're pairing the highest heat-generating pad compound with the lowest boiling point fluid on the least aggressive replacement schedule. That's the worst possible combination for brake fluid longevity. Japanese sport models, the GR86, the GR Corolla, the Lexus RCF, are delivered from the factory with specific pad compounds and specific fluid specifications that are calibrated together. The pad compound is chosen partly based on how much heat it generates relative to what the specified fluid can handle. American owners who upgrade to aftermarket high-performance pads without upgrading to DOT 5.1 fluid are running a system that's out of specification from the pad's design intent. Match your pad compound to your fluid specification. If you run semi-metallic or performance pads, run DOT 5.1 as a minimum. Change it every 18 months instead of 24. The additional cost of the accelerated interval is $30 to $50 per year. It's the correct cost of running a high-performance braking setup. Master cylinder internal inspection. The corrosion you can't see without looking. The brake master cylinder is the highest stress component in the entire hydraulic system. Fluid enters the master cylinder from the reservoir at ambient temperature. The master cylinder pistons compress that fluid under 300 to 1,200 pounds per square inch with every brake application. The internal bore of the master cylinder is the first surface that degraded fluid attacks. In Japan, the master cylinder bore is inspected during every major brake service, roughly every 4 years. The inspection is done by drawing a fluid sample from the reservoir and looking at it under magnification for metal particles, which indicate bore wear, and by checking the bore visually for discoloration or pitting if the component is accessible. In American service, the master cylinder is ignored until it starts leaking externally, which is the last stage of failure, not the early warning. Internal bore corrosion in the master cylinder presents before external leaking. The first sign is inconsistent pedal feel. A pedal that's firm at the top of the stroke, but gets progressively softer as you apply more pressure. This is the internal seals bypassing against a pitted or corroded bore. By the time external leaking begins, the bore is typically beyond the point where a seal kit will restore it, and the entire unit needs replacement. A quality master cylinder replacement on a Toyota or Lexus costs $250 to $600 plus labor. A brake fluid flush and moisture test every 2 years costs $80 to $120. Keep the fluid clean, and the chemistry inside the master cylinder stays within the range it was designed to tolerate. Let the fluid degrade, and you're paying for master cylinder corrosion on top of every other failure mode downstream. Full system documentation. The Japanese practice Americans abandon. This is the one that costs nothing and saves the most over the vehicle's lifetime. In Japan, meticulous service documentation is considered a fundamental part of vehicle ownership. Not a nice to have, a functional requirement. When a vehicle is sold in Japan, the service record book, the full history of every fluid replacement, every inspection, every part replacement, is treated as a financial document. A well-documented car retains significantly more value than an undocumented car with identical mileage. The documentation proves not just that the work was done, but when, with what specification of fluid, and by whom. In America, service documentation exists in one of 3 forms: the sticker on the windshield, the receipt you lost in your glove box, and the dealer's computer records that you don't own a copy of. None of these constitute a usable maintenance history for a vehicle you plan to keep past 200,000 miles. Start a physical service log. Date of service, mileage at service, fluid specification used, DOT 5.1, specific brand, lot if you have it, brake pad brand and compound, technician or shop. Any observations, moisture percentage at that service, hose condition, caliper condition. This takes 4 minutes after every service. Over 10 years and 150,000 miles, it becomes the most accurate diagnostic tool you own for predicting when the next failure is coming and demonstrating to any future buyer that this vehicle was maintained by someone who understood it. I can walk into a service bay, pull out a well-kept service log, and understand a vehicle's mechanical history in 5 minutes. That log tells me whether the current fluid is actually the specification listed, whether the intervals were followed, and whether any observed degradation rate is accelerating, which would indicate a component failure driving faster than expected moisture absorption. Without documentation, every service starts from scratch. You're paying to rediscover information that should already be known. Document your services. It costs nothing. Here's what you now know that most drivers, and honestly, most service advisors don't. Brake fluid is not a static component. It's a living chemistry that degrades continuously from the moment it's installed. The Japanese approach to brake maintenance treats it that way, with scheduled replacement intervals, moisture testing, modulator bleeding, reservoir seal replacement, and documentation that creates a complete picture of system health over the vehicle's entire life. The American approach treats brake fluid as a permanent feature like window glass that only gets attention when something goes wrong. By the time something goes wrong with a brake system, you're replacing calipers, master cylinders, rotors, ABS modulators, and brake lines instead of $80 worth of fluid. The math isn't complicated. $80 to $120 every 2 years? Call it $500 over 10 years. Maintains a brake system that can last 500,000 miles with correct care. One ABS modulator failure costs $1,500. One master cylinder costs $600. One pair of corroded out front calipers costs $400 to $800. You fund your own repairs when you skip the maintenance that prevents them. The Japanese figured this out 40 years ago. The American service industry would prefer you didn't. Maintain the system like the Japanese engineers who designed it intended. Or repair it on the American schedule they never intended but reliably create. Drop a comment right now telling me what mileage your Toyota or Lexus is at and whether you've ever had the brake fluid replaced on a proper interval. I read every one, and if there's a pattern in what I see, I'll build the next video around it. Speaking of which, coming up next, I'm going to show you the Japanese differential fluid secret that American 4x4 owners are paying for in destroyed transfer cases and seized rear differentials at 150,000 miles. If you own a Land Cruiser, a 4Runner, or a Tacoma, you cannot afford to miss it.